Okay, for more on this, we're joined now by analyst on governance, security and peace in East Africa, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. Very good evening to you, Abdullahi, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So this announcement by the HSC, or at least the suggestion, how well will it go down? I mean, given the fact that it's a short period before the elections were due to be held.
It is a very short period of time, but I wanted to make three observations. Number one, I think there is a growing set of agreements that is emerging out of most of the Africa's conflict and post-conflict countries. And one of them is, particularly from the external actors, that is multilateral institutions and Western countries, that election is a prerequisite for that country to join the community of nations, in the case of Libya now. And so a lot of effort is expanded on making the election, the ritual. Secondly, for the political elite in most of these countries, and for this case we are referring to Libya, they want to please the Western apparatus framework, that's the UN, the EU, and the United States, to show that they can hold the election for them to be welcomed. All these two together, what it does is it makes an election the be-all and end-all. So what we have is we make an election, which is a very, very important exercise, into a ritual. So what you end up having is, elections therefore become, something more. While it's a necessary condition, it's hardly sufficient. Democracy requires more than an election. So today is, the 9th of December, and elections were meant to be held on the 24th. And if now is when you realize that everything is not in order, then that speaks a great deal of not just the election, right, being held, but also to the larger question around 10 years since the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi.
And I want to touch on that point that you made on the ritualistic aspect of elections. The fact that you have General Haftar, who says at this point, his only concern at this point is to lead the people of Libya, but he is said to be responsible for the killing of thousands of people in the East. Just looking at the list of candidates who are running for president, is there a stringent enough, or should I say strategic way of coming up with the rules of the game of who qualifies to be a leader of a country that's survived 10 years of instability thus far, as you say?
And that is, again, when election becomes the be-all and end-all, in a setting like Libya, right? If we say we will have to have an election, the primary actors are the same actors that have been in the game, whether it's violence, whether it's conflict, whether it's having ICC cases in the case of, Muammar Gaddafi's son. And General Haftar's record is not great either. So he's somebody who has been accused of committing a egregious human rights violation. That is the problem with an election. Instead of, then what election does is, right, it makes, as a treatment, it makes the disease even worse. If Libya has had an election in 2004, and because of some of the unresolved question in 2004, this election again that we are supposed to, 2014, sorry, that we are supposed to have again, then becomes another problem. So we are just compounding problems upon problems. And when you have, right, election being reduced to a ritual, it ends up being a choicelessness, an exercise in choicelessness. You have General Haftar on one side, representing this eastern side of the country, and you have, Muammar Gaddafi's son, who has got an ICC warrant of arrest on the southern part of the country, whereas the eastern part, where it borders all these other countries, and they feel completely neglected, is completely neglected again in this process. I think that is the problem that we have when we make an election such an important and be-all exercise.
And I was going to mention that ICC indictment of Saif al-Islam Gaddafi because it again brings the question of eligibility, but more importantly, there's the issue of citizenship when it comes to General Haftar. How serious are concerns around that? We know that often in other countries, when competitors want to off another, they'll bring up this issue of citizenship.
It is an important issue, right? One of the things that I want our viewers to get is that the wave that swept away Gaddafi and, came from, Tunisia, went through Egypt, we saw Hosni Mubarak being deposed, we see Gaddafi being deposed. It was the wave of decades of people in most of the, North African countries and Middle East asking for proper representation, democracy, and human rights and rule of law. And so we are here 10 years later, seated having an argument if Libya is ready for an election. The question around people like General Haftar, who is being supported by the Russians, who is being supported by the UAE, who is being supported by Egypt, then becomes a very important question. What credentials does Egypt have to support General Haftar? They cracked down on probably the most united, urban protest for the removal of for the removal of Muammar Gaddafi, and what they got was another general who was more brutal than Hosni Mubarak. So I think the actors that are outside, that is, UAE, Egypt, as well as Russia, are making everything very difficult for Libyans now. For an average Libyan, if you tell him it's a choice between either of these guys, they'll rather go on with their lives. And that is the problem again, that you force an election because you think it's the only way to get the cream come up to the top. When the cream that you get, because they have been in the business for quite some time, General Haftar and Saif al-Islam, then that is what you are left with. And it doesn't serve the general interest of the local man, either in Tripoli or in Sirte.
So I believe some 24 candidates were told they did not qualify. On what basis? And do you agree then with the thinking that the Speaker of Parliament, Aguilar Saleh, is the consensus candidate amid what is said to be the challenges of which you've just raised, the electoral decisions that have been made around this, the role of the judiciary, the official institutions, which are obviously deeply problematic at this stage?
I think, again, for me, election, when we are focused on election, when other institutions, let's say if a dispute arises, you need a judiciary. You need the police for internal affairs. You need an electoral body that is independent and go across the country because there's peace for them to hold an election. For me, the biggest worry is I would rather for an election to be delayed than just to do election because we have to do an election, right? Again, that raises the biggest question. This date for the election did not drop from the sky. This date was known very well in advance. If nothing was done between then and now, then even if my position is maybe to postpone an election, what guarantee do we have 2 years, 3 years, 3 months, 6 months, that will not be sitting here again having the same question, is Libya ready for an election? And that, I think, it's a difficult question. We are not looking for a perfect situation, but in a fraught situation like this, you'd rather not have an election because it will make things worse than have an election just because we'd agreed to have an election. And this is where I think, the countries that are involved in Libya need to think, because we cannot just have an election for the sake of having an election.
So there are fears by some that failure to hold elections or even holding elections could lead to the kind of uprisings or the fighting that we saw between Tripoli and Benghazi in 2014. Do you share that view? And some placing the blame actually at Saleh's feet, saying that it's because he placed into law where there was no quorum. He made rules illegally.
I think he has some degree of blame. But then again, he is just one person. This is not an accident that we walked into. This is a problem that the international community, the backers of all these guys, the international, multilateral institution walked into it with their eyes open. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate failure, right? This is a serious dereliction of duties for people who are involved in this process to look at it and say, oh, we have to postpone. My way, it's up to me. It's not a question of choosing between, a good and a bad option. It's choosing between two bad options and picking the one that is of lesser than the other one. Having an election, because we want to have an election in a fractious situation like this, in a country where you have endemic problem of this of the state and peace and security, just because you say you'll have an election, you will make things worse. You'd rather wait for a few months, be able to have a modicum of state institution, state apparatus that can carry out the election, and then you have an election and be able to build on that, rather than saying, oh no, we've agreed that we have to have an election, we have to go full steam in having an election. But the problem is you need the consensus of all the candidates, and here is where the biggest problem lies, because some candidates feel that if elections are held on time, that is 24th of this month, they think they are going to win and they might not agree. So there are no good options on the table. And I think that is the prospect that we have to face. I want to emphasize one final thought, though. Instability in Libya is a recipe for instability in the southern countries or countries that are bordering Libya. We've seen this play out in Mali. We've seen this play out in Niger. We'll see it in other parts of the continent. And it doesn't present a pleasing scenario for anybody that is involved. If they think, if actors who are involved in Libya think that this will be contained in Libya, I think we will be in for a rude shock. And let's make very clear, Chad is having its own problem, and it used to be a bulwark against some of the problems in Libya. Now that, the former Chadian president is no longer with us.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, saying that the lesser evil for Libya is to hold off on elections, agreeing with the High State Council that perhaps February next year would be better for a more credible election. We're going to take a quick